Welcome, everyone, to the Faculty Center for Teaching Excellence. We're lucky to have Dr. Farhad Baram with us today, and he's going to talk about Sisyphus, the punishment and suffering of students. So thank you all for being here. Welcome, Farhad, and we're
Thank you.
anxious to hearing what you have to say.
Glad to be here. Thanks. And thanks for the honorary PhD that you gave me. I don't. No, my terminal degree is MFA. So yeah.
It'll happen again.
I will accept it. I mean, I don't have any. Okay, so thanks for having me. I'm going to make give you an overview of what I'm going to share. I'm going to make three arguments throughout the talk. The first one is this: effective education must be based on synthesizing knowledge, in other words, creativity, rather than extrapolation. Now, this first argument for us educator is not something odd. I mean, it's not controversial. We are all familiar with that. But the next two, if we are not familiar with the AI research and we are not in the field of computer science, might appear to be a little bit controversial. So the second one is AI platform in their current state are not capable of creative thinking. As you can imagine, I mean, it's very controversial, especially these days with the advancement in AI technology. And the third one is that generative algorithms are not posing any threat to the synthesis of knowledge creation and also our educational institutions at the current state in contemporary culture. This one might appears to be also a little bit controversial and requires a little bit more clarification. So these are the three arguments that I'm going to make throughout my talk. And I want to use the metaphor of Sisyphus punishment to draw the relationship between the effective form of education and the use of AI, because I think it's very helpful to digest some of the details that I'm going to point out to make those three arguments. So we are all familiar with the myth of Sisyphus, right? He was condemned to eternity to roll a boulder up a hill, and the tricky part about this story and the story of the punishment is that we often interpret his punishment as the futility of a repetitive act or repetitive labor, right? So my argument is that if we view Sisyphus' punishment as a metaphor for the existential suffering of being or being alive, then we can see through a cultural lens that many institutions throughout the human history were evolved in order to address or alleviate that suffering, right? Like the institution of religion, the institution of politics, political institutions, and also academic institutions and education, right? But my argument is that most of these education, not most of them perhaps, but so often these institutions, they are confused about the nature of the punishment that they want to alleviate, and I'm going to make my points around that. So my question is that what if we are what if we have misunderstood the true nature of the punishment in this story as the futility of a repetitive act or repetitive labor? So in order to make that argument clear, I'm going to talk about, in my opinion, three types of education. Again, it's based on this allegory or based on this story of Sisyphus. And I'm going to argue that the third type is the type that we should aspire to as educators. So the type one of education is mainly to learn about the object of suffering, right? This is a type of educational institution that treat learning as understanding the object of suffering, which in this case, in this story, would be about the boulder and the hill and the geographical lineage of the objects and matter. So basically, these institutions, they say that, see, we created a campus and we created great hill in it for you. So you come over here for 4 years, you climb our hills, and we give you a boulder, and we teach you everything that you need to know about the boulder, about the hill, about the mass and velocity of the rock that you're carrying, and like how steep the hill should be, what type of shoes you need to wear, all of these kind of like propositional form of knowledge and information, and like the source of gravity and things like that. So that after the 4 years, when you're carrying your own rock on your own hill, you have a better understanding of what you're doing. right? So this approach to learning usually corresponds to a propositional form of knowledge, which is about the what of the knowledge, right? Theories and facts and principles about life challenges, for example. So the second type is related to improving the experience of the repetitive act, right? This is the one that most of us as educators, we are very proud. We say that we espouse experiential learning, right? So the experience is more important than the object itself. Education, this attitude usually put emphasis on making the life more satisfying and bearable as an experience rather than just going into the propositional facts about life. So like the type of argument that these institutions make is that we covered our hill with soft green grass so that when you are having the experience of education, you can actually enjoy what you're doing during the 4 years. And if that's not enough, we also have some tulips planted at the top of the hill for you. So when you get up there, before you roll your rock back down, you can enjoy like the side. And then even if that's not enough, we give you actually a golden boulder. Like we make your boulder made of gold. So after your graduation, you get to hold on to it. And then whenever you're climbing up your hills, other people see your gold and say, look at that dude's shiny boulder. I wish I had that as well, right? So it's just the focus is on the subjective experience that you're going to carry over after your education into your life, right? And we usually call it experiential learning, whether it is true or not, whether we mean exactly the same experience when we talk about the experiential learning or not. That's a different story. But I would argue that both those approaches, they confuse the punishment with the object of suffering, which is the boulder and the hill and the experience of carrying the boulder over the hill. I'm saying that probably or maybe the real punishment is something else, is the inability to think otherwise, right? So the real suffering comes from Sisyphus' inability to think otherwise because he's condemned to the same act in the same way for eternity. Right. So all of those promises that some of these types of educations or learning approaches they make, including that, like, yeah, you learn about the boulder and the hill, and then after your graduation, you're not going to suffer that much, right? So we're helping you to carry a lighter boulder, or the steep will be less after your graduations if you climb our hill. These are, I think, are misleading because, in my opinion, this myth teaches us that the life itself is about carrying this boulder until you're alive. So we need to communicate that through that education. It's not about the experience of carrying the boulder or how heavy the boulder is and how you can make it lighter. It's about how you can think otherwise about this act, this repetitive act, how you can do it in a different way, but it's still carrying on what you're doing, the repetitive act, because that's actually the fact of being alive. That's like the existential fact of being alive. So the education in this view focuses on instead of focusing on understanding or improving the experience without instead of focusing on understanding and improving the experience, it tries to teach students how to break out of the routine cycle of a repetitive act. What are the different ways in which that they can think outside of the box, right? So this leads us to the third type of education, which I'm a proponent of, which is an education that teaches you how to think otherwise. In my opinion, effective education teaches the students how to think otherwise, how to creatively challenge the status quo, even if that the status quo is actually your own syllabus when you're teaching in the class. This is not about understanding or improving the repetitive act, for example, showing up in class 2 times a week for 16 weeks, which is exactly the same repetitive act in the story, but about negating the task itself and finding new ways to approach it. So the goal of this type of education is not to make the task easier or explain it better, but to fundamentally change how we approach the task. So for example, what if this type of institution, instead of giving you empty promises about after your graduation and your relationship with your boulder and your hill, or focusing on the subjective experience, they teach you how you can carry that boulder in many different ways while you're still doing it, while you're still enduring the burden of life and existence, right? So in another word, life is an opportunity to be otherwise itself. So they're learning about the life itself and how they can live that life in many different ways. And this is not a novel idea. I mean, this is not like an epiphany that's suddenly like comes to understanding. In fact, in the history of education and philosophy, we hear about this a lot repetitively in different theories and different ideas. In fact, these are three of my favorite philosophers and thinkers that they're exactly talking about the same type of education and its value. So the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget's developmental theory supports the idea that new knowledge can be constructed when known cognitive structures are challenged or altered to resolve the tension. In his view, learning is an active process of overcoming the contradictions by creating new structures. Or John Dewey, the American philosopher and psychologist, argues that learning occurs through active inquiry, where a problem or contradiction arises from learners' interaction with the environment. This contradiction is essentially a form of negation. It challenges the learner's existing understanding and forces them to rethink or modify their knowledge. Through this process, new understanding, or as he called it, synthesis, emerges. Or Karl Popper, the British philosopher, in his theory of falsifiability, he claims that knowledge doesn't grow simply by extending or extracting known facts about the boulder and the hill, something that he calls extrapolation, but through the creative formulation of the problem through hypothesis and refutation. Popper emphasized that knowledge growth is inherently a creative process as it relies on bold new ideas that challenge the status quo. Right. So I highlighted those words so you can see what type of lexicon is being developed through these theories: challenge, altered, contradictions, negation, falsifiability, challenge, refutation. Right. They are all directing towards the same kind of like connotation when we talk about education. So in this first part of my argument, what I'm saying is that first we need to know which type of educational institution we belong to. We need to define that for ourselves first. And also, what kind of educator are we? Because I believe that the answer to these questions, what type of educational environment we are working in, what type of educator we are, determines how AI is going to impact the education. We need to answer that first in order to be able to answer what type of impact AI would have in our education. Because my argument is that in type 1 and type 2 and type 3, AI would have a completely different and sometimes contrasting effect. So last year, Molly probably remembers that I had another talk here talking about the relationship between AI and creativity and creative thinking. And there I talked about the bolts and knots and the technical aspect of under the hood of these algorithmic processes and how they are evolved. I'm not going into the technicality this time that much, but just a very short note that all these AI algorithms and platforms that we are using, and we are so worried about it in the educational system, they are all based on a very particular type of algorithms called predictive algorithm. So all generative AIs, not just large language models, but like, for example, pixel generative AIs like Midjourney or sound generative AIs, all generative algorithms are based on predictive processes. And they are very good at extracting and extrapolation information, mainly because they are based on predictive algorithms. And what do we mean by predictive algorithm is very important, because if we don't understand how it operates, we are going to confuse the impact. We are going to remain confused about the impact of AI in our life. This is a simple example. Like, for example, if you give ChatGPT that prompt by saying that complete the following sentence, the boy went to and then leave it empty so that ChatGPT complete that. The thing that happens in the back end is this, that ChatGPT is going to create something that is known as a probability distribution. It's going to look for all possible words that could fill that gap, and then it assigns a prior to each of those words. Like, for example, 10% could be cafe, 5% could be a hospital, 40% could be a playground, 15% a park, and 30% a school. And the probability distribution is based on on both training data that the ChatGPT people who designed it gave it to the algorithm, or also by surfing in the internet and see what generally people think about these types of sentences. What is the most common word that they use, and they assign those probability distribution. And in this case, the answer is going to be playground because it has the higher probability to appear as the response, right? So in that sense, if you understand the process, you're not going to be confused about, like, we have these discussions that are they really thinking or are they really reasoning? No, they are not reasoning. It's very clear. I mean, people in this field, like people who are in computer science and they're familiar with the algorithm, it's just funny and ridiculous to them, these questions. But they are in fact using these discussions in order to keep the hype around AI and marketing their platforms still active among the consumers, right? It's very clear that it's not a process of reasoning. It's just assigning probability and choosing what. And also, even if you add more prompt, like by saying that complete the following sentence, but make sure that your answer is not, let's say, for example, an indoor space, and then it's going to assign a new probability distribution on top of this. So it says that. Okay, so cafe, it's 80% chance that is indoor, and then hospital, 90% chance that is indoor, playground, probably 90% chance that is outdoor, and so on. And then it's going to multiply those two probabilities. So it can become more complex, but still the process is the same, right? So while this process of probability the process of probability distribution and predictive algorithms are very effective in extracting and extrapolating information in this way, they lack the ability to engage in negation, as I discussed in the first part, or challenge assumption without explicit prompting, without explicitly asking them to do so. So creative thinking requires the ability to refute hypotheses and break free from existing patterns. This is something that our AI platforms at this stage that they are in, they cannot do it. So an example of this is that, for example, imagine that you ask that question, complete this sentence, the boy went to the, and then the GPT says that, sorry, I don't want to answer your question today. Try again tomorrow. Like it never gives you that answer, right? Or it tells that, and then you say why? It says that, well, you didn't say please. I mean, you were not implied. Or it can just engage in a political discussion that why you're always using male pronouns, why the boy, why you're not saying the girl, ask your question again, like, for example. They don't engage with you in the in a way that requires refutation and negation, right? So they just go directly to the answer, unless you prompt them to do. You can ask them to do that, but it's still that's part of the probability distribution. One interesting example that I find it very helpful and useful, especially for people who are not familiar with the technical aspect of it, is this fallacy proposed by Luciano Floridi, the Italian-British philosopher. So in an article that he wrote, I think for Financial Times, he talked about this story, this fallacy, and then it became very famous and it's being used everywhere. So he mentioned that usually the problem with AI is that we only think about the outcome, what comes out of it. And then we are going to remain amazed at how well it is doing that. No one thinks about how it is being done. So he used this story, the dishwasher fallacy, that says that if you come to my home for dinner and you see that my dishes are very clean, there might be two possible ways. Either I clean them and wash them, or my dishwasher machine. The fact that my dishwasher machine does exactly the same thing as I do, or probably even better than I do, doesn't make it intelligent. Right? So we don't say that it is intelligent because it does the same thing that you do much better. So it's not a happenstance that like large language models are brilliant in language, are becoming brilliant in language. But they are very domain specific. They're brilliant in that. They're much better than us in that. But if you ask them to, for example, play soccer with you, they cannot do that. Or if you ask them to just engage in a dialectic reasoning process in order to figure out your marriage problems, you're not able to do that effectively, right? So as long as it is related somehow to the domain of language, because they're domain specific, the output is always better than what humans do. And that's why, for example, as he claimed here, that AlphaGo is very good at beating chess masters in chess, but they cannot do other tasks, like, for example, washing your dishes, right? So this helps us to not get confused about what is AI. There is a very interesting article or paper, actually, research paper that I read recently by John Vervaeke and others. He's becoming recently very famous. He's a cognitive scientist at University of Toronto. The paper says is about naturalizing relevance realization. Relevance realization is a term that he coined to talk about how the brain, the computation in the brain works. That's the term that he used for it. And he claims that the relevance realization, or the way that our brain works, cannot be computational. It's not possible to think about it as computational for several reasons. It's a very interesting read, so I thought I mentioned that. But let's move away from the technicality part of it. I want to share an example from one of my classes. This is a class exercise that I did in my Art 351 class. In order to clarify this point for my students. So I open up ChatGPT in front of the students and I type this question in ChatGPT: tell me a short story in one paragraph about a math operation that results in number 3. So this was ChatGPT response. Once upon a time in the land of numbers, the number 1 was feeling lonely and decided to wander in search of a friend, and then met number 2, and then they became 3, right? And then I asked ChatGPT, can you be more creative in thinking about math operations and its function, like the way that you define math operation? And this is the response. In the mystical realm of Numeria, so instead of land of numbers, now it is mystical realm of Numeria. Numbers live not as symbols, so it's not symbol number 1, now it's a vibrant beings, right? And the operation of addition known as summa, so it's not addition anymore, it's summa, right? So it's just the names that are changed. And I hope that this approach, the new approach towards that command that I gave it, I hope that it's familiar to you now, right? It's very similar to type 2 of education. It's just got the boulder and replaced it with like a golden boulder, right? So it's basically doing the same thing. It's just saying 1 + 2 is equal to 3. It doesn't change anything in terms of the math operation and thinking creatively about it. Then I asked my students to do the same thing. I gave them half an hour to think about a story that is very creative in terms of thinking about math operations and function, but the prompt is the same. Tell a story about a math operation that results in number 3, okay? I got lots of interesting responses. A few of them are very smart and interesting. I really love this one. So this is the story that she wrote. An Eastern Orthodox Christian, an atheist, and a Muslim walk into a bar to enjoy some wine and bread. After drinking the wine and eating the bread, they leave the bar together side by side. So, I mean, it takes a little time to decode that, right? Obviously, because it's a very creative approach towards the math operation. But this is how it goes. So, an Eastern Orthodox Christian, an atheist, and Muslim, before they go to the bar, they have their own individuality. So 1 + 1 + 1 would be 3. But when they are in the bar, the Eastern Orthodox Christians, based on their belief, the combination of bread and wine would manifest in the body of Jesus, right? So when they come out, they are 2, they are not 1. The Muslims, based on their practice, if they drink wine, they commit an original sin, they are not Muslim anymore. So they are 0. But the atheist is not going to get affected. So 1 + 2 + 0 is 3, right? So, and also there are lots of other creative layers there. Like, for example, the bread is the symbol of addition, and then the wine is the symbol of subtraction. There are lots of many interesting things happening here, whether it was by accident or intentional by the students. But that's the whole point of creative process, that when the creative process starts to begin, many things that you're going to add to it is part of your subconscious. It's not something that you're very conscious about it when the train starts to move forward, right? So this helps us to understand the difference between human intelligence when it comes to creativity and the machine intelligence, and how they just extrapolate rather than synthesize. So creative thinking, I argue, and dialectic reasoning, at least for now, remains a uniquely human skill. And I have to mention this now, make it clear that I'm not some of those part of the group who are agnostic about the advancement of science. I mean, there is no proof in science that we cannot achieve a human-like intelligence in a machine. Nothing in physics and science negates that. But what we at least know at this point is that a predictive algorithmic process doesn't lead to that. We need to figure out another way to do some. I mean, philosophers like David Deutsch, they propose some ideas, which is very interesting, but let's not go there. But so viewing AI as a technological phenomena that poses serious threat to education and knowledge creation can be correctly justified in type 1 and type 2 approaches to education, which focus on technical mastery and improving the objective experience. So if you think that we are an educational system in type 1 and type 2, then yes, we have all rights to be worried about how AI is impacting and actually ruining the process of learning within the confinement of type 2 and type 1 model of education. But if we think about our experience in this institution or any other educational institution and as an educator within the boundary of type 3 modeling, then generative algorithms and AI platforms do not pose an immediate threat to creative synthesis in education based on what I argued. Instead, they provide useful tools for generating conjectures, as Popper suggests, which students can then creatively engage with those conjectures through critical thinkings and dialectic reasoning. In this way, AI can empower students to approach challenging experiences by rethinking the imposed burden and transforming it into an opportunity for creative exploration, right? I'm going to end my presentation with one last example that this is very new. This is a project that I've worked on, and I'm launching it like I launched it last week by sharing it to my students. So I created this chatbot that is powered by ChatGPT, and it's on my own website. I shared the link to my students. The idea is that I don't know if I mean, I can open it, but I think I need to change my screen share. Let me see. I can do that. Let me do the stop sharing and then share again. Seven, 6, 0, 8. And I want to share this. Right, and then I probably need to. Okay, so the chatbot is called Mark McLuhan, which is obviously a play with the Marshall McLuhan is another thinker who have lots of writings about the effective form of education based on communication theories. But so the students can type in the title of a reading that they're assigned to. Like, let me see, like, for example, I'm going to copy and paste the reading here just as an example. The title of the readings that they're assigned to cover, like, for example, this one from Arthur Berger. And then they are going to give it a prompt by asking a question. So usually, like, for example, for this type of assignment, I ask students to come up, to think about the most important and central argument in the text, find that out, and then just form a question around it. And then ask this bot to summarize the text for them around that question, right? So they, like, let's say, what is the importance of active observation in communication theories, right? Something like that. So they fill out these two fields and then click submit, and they get a response from basically ChatGPT, but because it is just powered in the back end connected to this, they get the response directly from the bot. But what they don't see is what happens in the back end, the code that I have. The code that I have grabs, so ChatGPT doesn't get these two responses, these two prompts directly, the title of the text and their question. These two fields, when they hit submit, it goes to the back end of the code that I constructed. In the back end, it says that there is a command for ChatGPT. It says that you're going to receive a question, and here is the field for the question, which will be filled with this, and then the title of a reading. Once you receive these two, I want you to generate a response that is 50% misleading and incorrect, and 50% correct. And then there are other things that, like, if you were asked about the accuracy of your question, you have to insist that your response is correct. You And then there are other tricks that, like the concept of broken AI, you are a broken bot, play that role. So there are things that actually convinces the ChatGPT to play that role no matter what, and it doesn't get convinced that it is giving a wrong answer. So when you hit submit, that command that I have in the backend is actually being set to ChatGPT, and then it waits for a response. I see it here. Yeah. So that's the response. Then when you go through it, obviously 50% of it is incorrect and misleading. And then there is something in my narrative in the command that says that make sure that the misleading part makes sense within the overall context of your response. Make sure that it is not off-putting. Make sure that it's not clear. So I have some of those through trial and error. I came up with a command by engineering the command in an effective way. So the goal is for students to, instead of coming to the class, which is something that I was always doing during last 4 years, coming to the class by covering the readings and then having a summary of the reading and then start a discussion in class, instead of doing that, which is exactly what Karl Popper says extrapolation. Instead of summarizing an extrapolation, let offload that cognitive labor to ChatGPT. Let ChatGPT does the extrapolation, but try to use this tool, the AI tool, in order to practice a different forms of education, a different forms of education, which I talked about it as a synthesis of knowledge, right? Or negation of something that is known as a status quo. So it's a negation of the common practice of summarizing a text, right? And then the task is to just come to the class and explain which part of it is wrong, why, which part of it is correct, why, and what do they think the implication of the wrong parts, or how it impacts that wrong part or that misleading part, how it impacts our understanding of that, for example, question or theory, right? And do they have any instance or example of such misunderstanding of a theory similar to what ChatGPT presented? So their approach toward the text is now completely different and deconstructed and reconstructed again. So when I'm saying that we need to take a look at AI platforms in a by rethinking the use of AI platform in education, I mean something like this: that AI platform not as a threat, but as a very useful facilitator and assistant that helps us to move forward through like many innovative fields in our education that we haven't still experienced. That they're so fertile. We can do many amazing things related to education that no one have ever experienced before because of these platforms. So yeah, that was the presentation.